Pioneer Knowledge Services welcomes you to the next Because You Need to Know. I'm your host, Edwin K. Morris. I serve as president and founder of this organization, and we are thrilled to offer this educational program. These design conversations bring you people's experiences from all over the globe in the field of knowledge management, nonprofit work, and innovation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marcus Engel, and I am coming to you from my home office in Orlando, Florida. There's a couple of interesting things near me, and near me is always a bit of a subjective term. I guess the most interesting things that are near me right now, number one, there is an unopened bag of sage bundles that are about a foot away from my keyboard for cleansing the house spiritually whenever I do that. What I hope is the other interesting thing that is close to me is one of my books, which is called The Other End of the Stethoscope. It's a memoir, and it's about really traumatic time in my life. It's also the most recent book that I've read because, not that I'm narcissistic and have to go read my own work, but we are just putting out an Audible copy of The Other End of the Stethoscope. We're doing it with artificial intelligence and voice cloning so that I don't have to actually read the book into the microphone, but it still comes out in my voice.
So tell me who a mentor is for you.
So a mentor, the first thing that I think of is my official mentor. Once I got out of college, I started speaking professionally. One of my mentors was a customer service speaker named Shep Hyken. Shep was the one who really showed me how to turn my personal story and trauma into something that could help other people and I could make a living at the same time. So Shep was officially a mentor, but I've had so many other ones. Growing up in small town America, I was involved in all types of high school activities. So my football coaches, some of my teachers, one of my advisors from college. I've just had so many mentors that have poured into me, and I, in turn, been able to pour into other people. And that's super rewarding to be able to see somebody take your mentorship and actually put it to good use.
Well, thanks for bringing that all up. I totally agree. If you were stuck on an island, what were the three must-have things you need?
Stuck on a deserted island, what are three must have? Obviously, food and water and shelter, but beyond that, I would certainly hope that I could still have an iPhone and access to the internet. That's because I do all of my data consumption and all of my reading through an electronic device. And so I'd kind of need that still.
What's your biggest hope?
My biggest hope is to leave this world a more compassionate place than I found it.
So your wealth of experience in trauma has actually been a jumping off point into a whole new world.
Yeah, you could say that. My life has taken some dramatic turns, some 180-degree turns.
Yeah.
As a young man in Missouri, I don't know, I was just a normal kid, right? I only knew what I knew, and I didn't have a whole lot of experience outside of my small town world. Whenever I started college, about 6 weeks into my freshman year of college, I came home for the weekend and went to a St. Louis Blues hockey game on a Saturday night with three friends that I had met at church camp. On our way home from that hockey game, my friends and I got broadsided by a drunk driver. That crash not only took 100% of my sight instantaneously and totally and permanently, I also received what is called a Lefort 3 fracture, which Lefort 3 is a surgical term, and it pretty much means that everything between the hairline and the chin has been crushed. Lots and lots of surgery. I've laid on an operating room table for well over 300 hours, months of hospitalization and rehab. It's led me into doing what I do now because when you've had as much experience at the other end of the stethoscope as I've had, you've seen the good, the bad, and the profound in patient care. those good stories and even the bad stories we can learn from. And that's what my work is to teach healthcare professionals what are the little things that we can do to help patients retain their dignity, their independence, their holistic self while they are healing.
Well, trauma, do you think the word trauma gets kind of overused a little bit? In just general sense and
Yeah,
social, oh, I'm wounded. I have trauma. Or is just the elevation of what trauma is very self-dependently defined?
I think it is self-defined because obviously what may be traumatic for me, and I'm talking a small emotional trauma, say that I get in an argument with a family member or something like that,
Yeah,
that hurts me deeply and I carry that trauma.
yeah.
Whereas somebody else can walk, the other person can walk away from that not feeling traumatized at all.
So it's a sensitivity,
Sure, certainly.
personal sensitivity to things. Similar to, it's cold in here. Well, I'm not cold. It's hot in here. It's very subjective.
Sure.
I want to pull up a definition. Webster says trauma is an injury to living tissue caused by an extrinsic force or agent. And this is the did you know, which I love in Merriam. They add more data to the word. Trauma is the Greek word for wound. Although the Greeks used the term only for physical injuries, nowadays trauma is likely to refer to emotional wounds. That gets into the realm of the psychic or the psyche of what's woundful or sensitive to you, and everybody's different.
Sure.
So how do you think organizations, and I'm going to bring this back to communities or organizations of people, either way, how does an organization one side bring up it's good to be sensitive, but then kind of balance that out with we can't be super sensitive to everything, or is that even a thing to try to get to?
Well, right. This brings up a really interesting question. And I work with those caregivers at the bedside. Typically, my audiences, my people are any of those people who physically lay hands on a patient. And they have to balance things. How do I care about this patient physically? How do I help them get all their physical needs met while they're under my care? And then emotionally, can I help them too? And what I really try to inspire in my audience is that the balance can come just from being patient. The balance can come just from taking an extra moment because there have been studies that talk about how if a doctor comes into a room to talk to a patient and the doctor sits down, that patient perceives that doctor was in their room for a lot longer than they were.
Hmm.
The doctor may have only been in their room sitting down for 90 seconds, but the patient perceived it to be 4 or 5 minutes.
Hmm.
When we can take just a little bit of time and step out of the busyness of life to be present in the moment with that patient, that's what I'm trying to get healthcare professionals to do, to slow down a little bit, to be able to take care of that patient. So you're not balancing 100 tasks that you have to do in an hour. You can really focus on the holistic healing of that patient.
Well, that takes a skill of personal control because you're talking about a Zen master type of ability that allows yourself to be present and not frazzled by the 75 other things going on that day.
Sure.
Well, it sounds real easy, but how do you do it?
Right, right. And you're right. A Zen master would do it perfectly, but unfortunately, none of us are Zen masters. As much as I
No.
try, as much meditation as I can, as I do, I can't claim that title. But what I can do is remind people just the little ways that they can be present. There is a doctor at Vanderbilt University. She is also a nun. She has a process of knocking on a patient's door, dipping her head, saying the fastest Hail Mary in the world before she steps in to speak with every patient. And I think that is a centering practice. That's a centering
Mhm.
practice. That's what we can do.
In the world of overreactions and everything's an issue, the practice of humanity takes some work. And when everybody is frazzled by all things personally, it's hard to be outside of yourself in order to be centered. In my experience studying shamanism, it is a practice that takes work. I mean, it's just like going to the gym. If you don't go, it's not going to get the results. And that mental model of your example with her having the process probably starts before she touches the handle or touches the door to turn that on, to turn on that rhythm and brings her to the focal point of now.
Yes.
So in an organization of or community, and like with your nurses, how do you build the practice? How do you train people? And it's kind of a protect themselves, right? So it's a dual purpose. It protects them as a human and a soul on the planet, but it also brings better service to the client or the patient.
So there's a few ways of doing this, and the way that I am most familiar with comes out of my academic background. So I have a master's in a field that's called narrative medicine. If you're not familiar with narrative medicine, it's not real surprising. There are only two narrative medicine programs in the country. The one that I went to is at Columbia University. I graduated in 2011, and my class was only the third to complete the master's level training program.
Wow.
And so it's still a very new and emerging field, and it's a conglomeration of medicine and healthcare and philosophy and social work and counseling and sociology and psychology and literature. What the ultimate purpose of narrative medicine was originally was to help doctors learn how to deeply listen to their patients. So when a patient is giving a report about themselves, the doctor is picking up on the subtleties of what that patient is saying. And the doctor is learning how to ask open-ended questions so that they can most effectively treat that patient. That's wonderful. The thing of it is, I hang out with nurses and I'm a businessman. So, what I do with nurses is reflective writing and therapeutic journaling. And I base this all off of a study. It's a seminal study in therapeutic writing and journaling. Do you want to hear about this? Because I think it's super.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating. I've never heard of the
Sure.
topic, and that's how people learn new
There
things.
you
So
go.
bring it on.
So there is a social psychologist in the state of Texas named James Pennebaker. Pennebaker did some of the original studies back in the 80s of using writing and reflective journaling to overcome trauma or to better process trauma. And so what he did is he took about 30 or 40 students, and all of these students reported that they had had some type of sexual trauma in their background. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't have to disclose what that was, but everybody had some type of sexual trauma in their background. Pennebaker brought these students together for 4 days in a row, 20 minutes at a time for 4 days. On the first day, he tasked these students to spend the next 20 minutes writing about the most traumatic, upsetting, horrific thing that you've ever been through.
Okay.
And they wrote on that for 20 minutes. And then everybody went home. Day number two, they brought them back. Second verse, same as the first. Write for the next 20 minutes on the most horrible, traumatic, upsetting thing that's ever happened to you. Now, on day number two, you could write about that same event as you wrote about on day number one, or you could choose a totally different trauma to
Okay.
write about. Third day, same thing. Fourth day, same thing. Write for 20 minutes about your trauma. And at the end of that study, they followed these students over the next semester, and the students had better academic performance, better interpersonal relationships. They had better health, which was how many times a student went to the campus infirmary over a semester. And these students who were in the part of the study went less often. And so, what Pennebaker and his colleagues discovered is it's often not so much the traumas that hold us back, it's the secret keeping
Ah,
about the traumas. When we write our traumas, we get to process them and we get to tell them, and they come out of our heart, out of our brain, out of our psyche onto the paper and in the writing, the physical writing, longhand
Yeah.
writing of our stories, we're working them out to where they don't have as much control over us psychologically.
Yes, yes. The impact of holding on to pains of the past is a wound keeping element that keeps that energy there. And what you're speaking of is an exercise I've seen in various ways. But if you're an employee of an organization and you got wounds, you're holding on to these stories of, well, I hate that guy because he's a jerk, or whatever the infraction is. Let's go back to what we said. Trauma is your perception of a wound.
Mhm.
That's what it is. So we don't have to overeducate it. We don't have to overcomplicate it. If you're able, in a holistic way, express that wound and express it outside of yourself, this works in conversation also, and you get it out, you're doing two things. You're telling the story of the whole nut roll, right? You're basically representing that incident or wound. And then it's expressed outside of you. So you're witnessing, you're providing witness to that. So it's out of the dark and somebody can see it. That process in and of itself relieves a lot of the internal mechanisms that make it more bad than it should be. Not to discount it, but just to relieve the control it has over your physical and emotional self.
Sure.
It allows it to heal. It allows it to be less than, which is a positive.
It is. It is. I like the people that I work with, the nurses, the doctors, the emergency crews, EMS, etc. These people witness so much human suffering on a daily basis. At certain points, it feels like it never ends. And when it feels like it never ends, like you're not making a difference, that's when compassion fatigue and burnout set in, especially in the helping professions. I feel like this reflection and storytelling is really, really necessary. I'm not naive enough to think that every nurse is going to go home at the end of their shift and write for 20 minutes, right? That's probably not going to happen. So what I do is I just encourage nurses at the end of every shift, open up the notes app on your phone and write out the thing that was a win today. What was a win for you today? This patient gave me a heartfelt thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Write that down. One sentence. And what is one thing that happened today that if it were to happen again tomorrow, you would do it differently? And so you write down a learning experience. And it
Oh,
doesn't take very long
learning.
to put
Yes.
together a pretty nice fat stack of the good that you're doing, right? You can look back over those
Yeah.
notes and see the good that you're doing, see how much you're learning, keeps us engaged in the work. If you've ever been a patient and you've had a healthcare professional that was disengaged, that was bored or going through the motions, or worse yet, even slightly cruel or what you perceive to be cruel, these are the kind of people that could so benefit from expressive and reflective writing.
I want to go back to your post accident. You shared with me this
Hmm?
concept that caused the inspiration for you to keep going. Someone held your hand.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me the story that helped that shift for you?
So this really gets down to, okay, well, this is all nice and fine and good, but how do we use it in a practical sense? How do I use this on the job? What I always come back to is the essence of compassion is what I received that first night in the emergency department. That first night that they hauled me into the emergency room, luckily the crash site was only about 3 miles away from a level 1 trauma center.
Hmm.
Even with a distance that close, EMS still had to perform a cricothyrotomy in my throat in the field. Those are rarely, rarely done. Most paramedics will go their entire career and never have to do one. I was hanging by a string when they rolled me into the emergency room. There was a 20-year-old patient care tech named Jennifer. Jennifer's assignment, when I wasn't in surgery, Jennifer's assignment was that she had to stay by my bed and hold my hand. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, that was her assignment. Maybe that was also to just make sure I was still breathing. but her assignment was to stay by my bed and hold my hand. I was in and out of consciousness so much that whenever I would come back into consciousness, it was just this bludgeoning of pain and darkness and fear and terror. Jennifer held my hand, and every time she could tell that I was awake, she would say what I say are the two most comforting words any human being can say to another. And those words are, I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here. When we can truly be here, be there, be present for another person in their time of suffering,
Yeah.
that's
That's power right there.
one of the other things that makes us human.
And it walks us right into this friendly term you introduced me to called personalism. Personalism, the definition, a system of thought which maintains the primacy of the human, or that reality has meaning only through the conscious mind. Personalism must be a bit of a ethos that you're working with.
Yeah, ethos and pathos. So I've been adjunct faculty at University of Notre Dame now for 7 or 8 years, I guess. And I have the good fortune to teach pre-meds a course that's called Introduction to Personalism in Medicine. Now, personalism is a term that's a little dated these days. We probably wouldn't even use that term so much. We would use the term human experience. What is the human experience in medicine? I also bring that out of my patient experience work in hospitals. But the whole idea is if you've ever been to a doctor or a hospital and you felt like it was an assembly line, that's what we're working against. This is the opposite of that assembly line. This is when a doctor has a moment to be able to connect with you on a personal, humanistic level. What can they glean during that short interaction that helps the care team, the doctors, the nurses, et cetera, see that patient in the bed as a person, not just a patient?
That doesn't seem like we would have to teach that. 200 years ago, would we have to teach that? Is the culture and society changed? Or, and better yet, is there a society that doesn't need to be taught? Is Western medicine the only ones that have to learn that?
I doubt it.
Okay.
Because I think if we look at Eastern thought and religion, we go back thousands of years. There was still the anxious mind. There was still the monkey mind that everybody has that's bouncing all over. And when our monkey mind is bouncing all over, that means we're not in the moment, present with what's going on right here, right now. I do feel like that this is somewhat a human trait that we all need to work on.
Yeah. There's a Psychology Today article called The Paradox of Empathy, dated June 2nd, 2024. The first paragraph I'm just going to read. It's a short one. The more we care about someone, the more difficult it is to help them. Despite our intentions of relieving their pain or suffering alongside them interferes with our capacity to be helpful. I guess I've seen that maybe a little bit, or maybe we just not good at being empathetic as a human on the planet.
Yeah, that's a good question. And where I'm thinking about that, whenever you're reading that, I'm thinking about professional distance between nurses, right? We want the nurse to see that person in the bed as a person, not just a patient. But on the other hand, I think this goes back to the balance that we were talking about in the beginning, and probably what the rest of this article talks about. Can we care too deeply? Well, to a certain extent, for hospital nurses, you're doing a lot of work, and it's not the only patient you have. To pack as much of that care and compassion as you can in during the healthcare interaction, that is key. But how do we do that and still keep professional distance? Well, we humans are pretty good at forgetting things. If you ask a nurse, hey, do you remember this patient that you had in here last week? There's a good chance that no, they're not going to remember that patient because it's been a week ago. They've seen 40 other patients since that time. But how do we then balance our empathy and our caring without it going overboard? I think professional caregivers do that pretty well.
And probably if they don't, that's where you get the burnout, right? The frustration and the burnout because they're taking on more than they need to or don't have the barriers of self-protection set up to just keep that at a distance.
Mhm.
Because some people adopt other people's pain and suffering.
Certainly.
And then it becomes their burden or it becomes a symptom in them.
And I sit there thinking too, this is not a moral failing of people to get burnt out or have compassion fatigue or just be wrung out from the job. I mean, that happens in every profession, right? Everybody is prone to burnout.
Yeah.
But it's super important that we keep coming back every day so that they can take care of people like me.
Yeah, I would say probably in the medical field, not knowing this, but just knowing I've been to a few emergency rooms, the people in emergency management or emergency response stuff has probably got a higher impact than the normal come into the office at 5 and we'll fix that.
A little bit different, yeah.
Right. The chaos itself, I know, creates a whole level of energy, but gee whiz, I can't imagine somebody working in that environment for decades.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In my most popular book, which is called I'm Here, Compassionate Communication and Patient Care, I write a lot about my favorite nurse, Barb, who worked ICU and plastics floor for 42 years.
Wow.
That's a lot of years. The same floor, same hospital for 42 years. That's something you don't find much these days, right?
That's amazing. No.
Her story is she's just absolutely a nurse at heart. She is a compassionate human being. She is a caregiver at heart. The way she connected with me when I first came under her care, I had been in the hospital for a week or two. I was just coming off of a 25-hour facial reconstruction. One of the first things she did to me was ask me, do you want me to call you Marcus or Mark? Now, keep in mind, at this point in time, my head is swollen up to the size of a basketball. I've got a trach in my throat. I've got my jaws wired shut and my eyes sewn shut. I am a horror show in front of her, but she took the time to be personal and ask me, what do you want me to call you? And that spoke volumes to me. I just feel like that's one of the best ways that a healthcare professional can get on the good side of a patient is simply by asking, what do you prefer to be called?
Yes, that is a person-to-person initial contact that helps build trust.
Exactly, exactly.
All right, well, before we get into the compassionate communication skills that you teach, what would be your definition of the term knowledge management?
Wow. So I learned this term from you recently. I learned the term from you. However, this idea of dissemination of knowledge throughout a large and complex organization, that's what I've been doing for 10, 20 years now. Is really trying to get this information into the hearts and minds and practices of those caregivers that are on the front lines. And I keep referring back to healthcare professionals, and 90% of the work that I do is with healthcare professionals, but really this kind of stuff is just human. We're all going to have someone in our life who has suffered, and we get to be that Jennifer or that nurse Barb to be able to be there for somebody. That's a privilege that we get. That's a privilege.
You bring up a point that I want to stress here is that they may not get the recognition for the effort they put forward. They are not doing it to be reciprocal. They are doing it because they're genuine.
Right.
I want to make that case because some people think, well, I treated them nice. Why are they treating, or whatever. There's a lot of judgment involved with that exchange. They don't need that reciprocation. That's just the way they are. That's their nature.
I guess one of the things that I often work with is the culture of an organization. I'd have to go find you this exact stat and quote.
Okay.
It's thought that if you don't have to get the knowledge to everybody in the organization. You just have to get it to a percentage of them who will then disseminate it for you. It seemed like in healthcare, at least with the idea of culture change, that could be as little as 10% of the organization. So when I go and work with organizations, I want to get at least 10% of the working staff in to see me in hopes that that will start to shift some culture in more positive directions.
We talk about medical cultures. I will say in my learnings of knowledge management and the Masters of Science program, one of the prominent organizations in the United States that did it in the medical field was the Mayo Brothers. The Mayo Brothers brought in this holistic concept of communicating and developing knowledge-based. They didn't just have one doc go, well, you need to do this. They actually reversed it and created a knowledge management sharing methodology that made them super distinct in the field.
Yeah. And there's many organizations that have tried to build something similar. It works for Mayo.
Oh.
The Mayo model works for Mayo. I don't know of too many other organizations that do it like Mayo, but you're also getting out of my realms of expertise here a little bit.
That's good. That's good. We're pushing each other in new directions. Mm-hmm. So the Mayo Clinic, if you all don't know, I mean, just search knowledge management and Mayo Clinic, and they're still producing a fair amount of content. So it's just as an FYI. So now that we've discussed what knowledge management is, or what your perception is, let's hear about what you teach in compassionate communication skills.
We talked about the compassionate communication like Jennifer gave to me with I'm here. I say the three most compassionate things that you can say to another human being. First, I'm here. Second, me too. And third, I got you. I've got you. And I think whenever we communicate in that way, we are showing solidarity, we are showing understanding, and we're showing awareness of another person's suffering. And so by those three responses, I'm here, me too, and I've got you, that's where the compassionate communication.
Yeah, that's the gold.
That's the foundation. Yeah, the foundation.
If we translated that into any other community or organizational structure with human-to-human contact and work flows and how the business process was work, if you remembered those three things in order to practice, just like your example of the sister nurse that would come in the door and do her mantra before she walked in to set the stage for her psychologically and emotionally, and it provides a intentful design. It's an intentful design. Where you worked, instead of doing the quippy, and I'm using myself as an example, my retort or my witty response to something to keep it light or laugh or to be jovial instead of being empathetic. If I just said, I'm with you, I'm here, and just leave it that short, concise, and let it lay. It is such a humanistic effort that it becomes, I think, too simple to not do anything like that, because those are bridge makers. Those are ways that strengthen a culture. Right. And I think there's a certain level of sarcasm that comes through on so many different channels that people use sarcasm in order to keep away from feelings or empathy.
Yeah, I go with what you said at first there. This ain't rocket surgery, right? This is just human beings being human being to one another. But because we often get so caught up in our own heads and in our own tasks and our own lives and our own thoughts, we can forget about that patient that's at the other end of the stethoscope. When you talk about cynicism or sarcasm, yeah, I get it, because I tend to have a typical bit of a sarcastic sense of humor, a bit of a cynical, dark sense of humor as well. But as a caregiver, when you're taking care of a patient, it may be a normal Tuesday for the caregiver, but it could be one of the most significant days of that patient's life. That's something to keep in mind. When it's one of the most significant days of another person's life, do we need to go in? Well, we definitely want to go in with appropriate humor, but we also want to go in there with the knowledge that they are suffering in some way.
I'll share a story that was shared with me. I was a volunteer with a hospice in Western New York for a couple of years, and I worked exclusively with combat veterans because I was one. And I was able to sit with a man that had served in World War II and the Korean War. Now, this goes to exactly what you're saying, and I'm glad I remembered it. He had told me that he was so angry at this age, still in his deathbed, holding on to that wound. So this is a good example of holding on to a wound. So he told me he'd gotten brutally messed up physically, head injury with a big piece of equipment, and just he was racked. And all he could remember was this nurse that said, "Oh, you poor thing. Oh, you poor," and he reacted with such a visceral response to that language And I was like, really? I can hear my grandmother saying that. But he found it so negative in putting him into a class, or I don't know. He threw a lot of attachment around it. I want to think in the process that I spent hours with this man, but he took it so painfully and woundingly that he kept it. That by him sharing that story, but sharing the story with me, maybe that helped to dissipate that energy.
I feel like there's healing in the telling of our stories. And I know that all too well anecdotally from personal experience and having been a professional speaker for the last 25 years, that by me being able to tell my story the way I want to tell it, with the elements that I want to tell it, is it takes it from something that's tragic to something that's triumphant. We can build off of our stories. We can take our stories and let them hold us back, as your case with this veteran, or we can take something horrible that's happened to us and learn from it and grow from it and evolve from it.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to land on. Let's all work on taking something that was tragic and let's look at the triumphant side of things if we allow ourselves to go there. I think there's a certain level of humanity that just wants to hold on to that because that wound defined them. Oh, I can't do that. I had this happen. And it becomes a barrier in a protective way that's not really helpful.
Yeah. And, through a lot of counseling, I've learned that too. A lot of self-inquiry. I've learned that, you can hold on to these stories. And people have asked me, well, you got hit by a drunk driver. It was somebody else's choice that is the reason that you broke all the bones in your face. You had 300 hours of surgery, permanently blind. Yes. But if I spend all of my time angry and pissed off at this guy, does that hurt him? No. It hurts who? Me. I figured that this guy took my sight. I'm not going to let him have my happiness. I'm not going to let him have my outlook. I'm not going to let him have my perspective. I'm going to keep living and realize that this was an incident that happened, terribly horrible incident that needed to be worked through. At this point, I've come out on the opposite end of it, a stronger, hopefully wiser person that has the privilege of being able to share that information with other people, and hopefully they can become wiser and grow from it too.
The challenge is going back to our Zen master kind of everything's good and Om and I'm peaceful and everything is calm, is that we have to endorse our ability or improve our ability to respond instead of react.
React, yes, exactly. And that is something that I've worked on for years, how to respond instead of react. I go back to Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning when he talked about that in between the stimulus and the response, there is a power or there is a space. And in that space is where your power lies. I love that. I love that because I want to respond and not react.
Exactly. That's a great concept, and I'm glad we landed on that. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise. And I want everybody to go work on that space in between.
Yeah, Edwin, thanks for having me on the program today. It's been great spending some time with you. Hopefully we've disseminated a little more knowledge, and I really appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening to Because You Need to Know, the reference podcast in knowledge management. My name is Soni Tonemi. As an art administrator, Because You Need to Know has been my go-to podcast and has helped me hone my management skills. Please consider sponsoring the podcast with your business.
Thank you for joining this extraordinary journey, and we hope the experiences gained add value to you and yours. See you next time at Because You Need to Know. If you'd like to contact us, please email byntk@pioneer-ks.org or find us on LinkedIn.